Back to order. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, and members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking, and for those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, of course, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, raise your hand. Of course, we have the questioning order here, so that will work very well. So now I'd like to welcome our witnesses on the matter of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. Introducing Dominique Cauet, Professor and Chair, Asian and Indo-Pacific Studies, Université de Montréal, by video conference. Also by video conference, Claude Vaillancourt, Association pour la taxation des transactions financières et pour l'action citoyenne. And from the Canada West Foundation, Carlo Dade, Director, Centre for Trade and Trade Infrastructure. Each of you will have 5 minutes to make an opening comment. Monsieur Cauet, we'll begin with you.
First, I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation. It's an opportunity to discuss something that I think we don't talk enough yet in Canada. I'll be speaking in French, but I'm willing to answer a question in French and English.
What I'd like to present this evening are 5 reflections on the Canadian strategy on the Indo-Pacific, Canada-China. The 5 main ideas that I'd like to espouse, and I'll be discussing those in my opening remarks, is the emergence of China on global power dynamics. The second aspect I'd like to broach is the power dynamics in Southeast Asia. That's the area that I'm working of, which in my opinion represents both the challenges and opportunities that are there, given that that area is closest to China and they have lengthy experience of China. And I'd also like to talk about Chinese diasporas in Southeast Asia and then tie the role of Chinese diasporas with Canada's role. And if we have time, I'd like to discuss Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, intentions, and perhaps an initial report card. So the first idea, what are the power dynamics? That's what we're focusing on primarily today, having to do with the emergence of China and emerging tensions between China and Canada. I think that this is an important and interesting juncture, i.e. the end of the San Francisco system, which was implemented in 1951 at the end of the Second World War, There was a treaty signed between the Allies and China, which shaped regional cooperation among Asian players, including Canada and the North American bloc, if you will. And under that system, the Asian and Indo-Pacific region was subject to US multilateralism, so under US influence. And this was led by the United States and allowed its allies to have access to its marketplace and international multilateralism. Now, it encouraged Asian countries to participate in international fora. Now, in the context of the Cold War, this structure dominated international relations in the East. It had a direct and adverse impact, for example, in the Indochina area, on regional initiatives. Now, today, I'd like to indicate that we have moved beyond the San Francisco system. We're seeing a decline in the US influence in the area, and increasingly we're seeing commercial, financial influence that is burgeoning from region to region and with China, which is going far beyond the influence of the United States. So calling into question multilateralism in the San Francisco system has also led to a calling into question of US influence, including Canada's, in the region. Now, this San Francisco treaty, which has been called into question, has led to a number of new initiatives in which China often plays a central role. And I'd like to talk about Chinese multilateralism, not American multilateralism, but how China practices its own version of multilateralism. And there's an increase and intensification of China's participation in various multilateral programs. For example, the Shanghai Five, the International China Cooperation, the Six-Party Talks, in which China is playing an increasingly important role, not only with international organizations, but regional organizations in Asia. And third, it's created its own international organizations. It practices a form of flexible multilateralism in order to engage a number of various states' governments and work alongside them without encroaching or interfering with their domestic issues. We've also seen attempts to establish a rapprochement with Japan, which hasn't worked yet. But what is clear is that increasingly there's a more assertive approach on the part of China in the region, i.e. Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. And in many contexts, China seems to be in competition with the United States. There's a debate raging among specialists in the region on this particular issue. What kind of tensions will emerge and what will they mean? For a number of researchers, China is the catalyst by way of which we should view these issues. And we've seen in multilateral fora that there's a duality between China and the United States. There's another more optimistic viewpoint on this. Despite the emergence of China in this regard, we're seeing an increasing number of fora for dialogue that are dominated by the West and the US bloc, as well as organizations that are dominated by Asia. And we see this as a positive thing. And I'll conclude with my final point. There are two major visions. The first models itself on realism, which states that the emergence of China will inevitably lead to confrontation or rivalry between China and the countries associated with the US bloc. So some authors have referred to the fact that this region is ripe for rivalry. And the second issue, or adverse impact, the emergence of China is making itself known through international trade and fora for international cooperation. China needs outside markets to develop itself domestically. So there is the idea behind this of security issues. So I'd conclude by saying that it's important, on the one hand, to be sensitive to issues such as what will an emerging China look like going forward, and secondly, are the interactions on the world stage going to be positive, or are they going to lead to the erecting of walls? And thirdly, is Canada well positioned to play an important role in this power dynamic? And I think that Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy is attempting to do this, but it's facing a number of constraints that we could discuss in the question and hour period.
Merci, Monsieur Vaillancourt, vous avez 5 minutes.
Or maybe a little more if you need it, but not much more. Okay.
Bonjour. Ben d'abord,
Good evening. I'd like to thank the committee for this invitation. For the past 25 years, as an engaged citizen, I've been interested in international trade and my concerns about social justice through Attaque Québec Association. I classify Canada's trade ties with other countries into 3 categories: those with countries with an economy equivalent to our own, those with developing countries, and those where forced labour exists on a large scale. This last category is problematic for 2 reasons. Firstly, these countries have a competitive advantage because they can produce goods at a lower cost since they exploit their workforce, but by far the worst problem is the humanitarian catastrophe that this exploitation entails. The offences committed against the Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples in China have been recognised by Canada: genocide, forced labour, quote-unquote political re-education camps where torture is practised, among other things. And all of this in the context where the capacity for surveillance, aided by technology and artificial intelligence, is reaching unimagined levels. And let's not forget that the Uyghurs are harassed even outside China, including in Canada. This situation should prompt Canada to react strongly, because China is engaging in new levels of repression that could be mimicked by other countries. Of course, in the face of such a powerful and influential country, our capacity to take meaningful action is limited. But we can at least take a stand by refusing to accept in Canada the products of forced labour out of Xinjiang. In this respect, Canada is far from exemplary. In the United States in recent years, 2,547 shipments of products suspected of being the product of forced labour by Uyghurs have been banned from entering the country. During this period, only 1 shipment from China was stopped in Canada before eventually being allowed in. Clearly, Canada is lax and must urgently tighten up the criteria used to determine when an embargo is placed on goods in overly dubious conditions. Countries such as France, Germany, Norway, and the United States have developed policies along these lines. Canada could go at least that far and create its own model, which may serve someday as an example. In the past, Canada has not distinguished itself by its willingness to stand up to cases of exploitation and repression. In 2014, Canada signed an investment protection agreement with China, despite the outspoken criticisms of human rights advocates, and despite there being a lack of reciprocity baked into this agreement. Canada continues to support investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, even though these have favoured, among other things, the expansion of Canadian mining companies into Indigenous lands. The economic liberalism promoted by the free trade agreements negotiated by Canada over many years has encouraged the expansion of regions in the world where workers are exploited, such as the Maquiladoras in Mexico.
Monsieur Vaillancourt, si vous...
A little, the interpreters are struggling to keep up. Okay? Thank you.
le Canada,
Canada seems to have moved away from this paradigm where low prices for Canadians and the profits raked in by big business are worth more than the plight of countless workers and the protection of the environment. The official recognition of the genocide afflicting the Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples and other minorities in China forces us to rethink certain aspects of our trade relationship with China. We need to take meaningful and strong steps to prevent the products of forced labour from finding their way onto shelves of our shops. For example, by enacting legislation on the prevention of forced labour of Uyghurs along the lines of what exists in the United States, binding legislation requiring due diligence on the part of companies when it comes to human rights and the environment, an overhaul of the Office of the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise by turning it into an independent office with strong investigative powers. We also need to rethink the free trade paradigm that has characterised our economy for the past 30 years and put in place policies for industrial relocalisation and export substitution industrialisation. Not only would this reduce the production of greenhouse gas emissions caused by transportation of goods over very long distances, but by limiting the quantity of products coming from China, it would make it easier to identify imports and limit the risk of bringing in the products of forced labour. A raft of measures such as these would demonstrate strong disapproval of the way in which the Uyghurs and others are being treated by the Chinese government. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you, Mr. Van Korten. And we'll now go to Mr. Dade for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, membres du comité.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to appear before you once again. I think that I appeared before you 3 years ago.
To have heard Canada West Foundation work referenced during the committee. I would like to thank the committee members that brought that to our attention, and also to witnesses who mentioned our work. Today, you're well familiar with Canada West work. We published the only brief on Western Canada's relation with the Indo-Pacific and with China. We've also done analysis of the Indo-Pacific strategy, convened a summit of Western or Prairie trade ministers to discuss the strategy. But I would like to switch the focus today and talk about a comparative analysis of the strategy based on my previous experience as Executive Director of Canada's Latin America think tank during the time of the implementation of the America strategy. Had I realized that the minister responsible for the strategy was going to be in the room, I might have prepared a bit. I'll take my life into my hands and try to make some comments regardless. I'm not going to talk about LNG. The government's already been excoriated on that by previous witnesses, so that frees me to take a bit of a different tact. On the America strategy, think about this as a foreign ministry official back at headquarters in their country or in their capital, or think about it as a officer assigned to Canada from a foreign country to follow the Indo-Pacific strategy. One of their first steps would be to look at Canada's previous attempts to have a framework to understand and analyze the current strategy. So I would take this tact and pull out 3 things from the history of the America strategy that may be hopefully helpful in your study and your recommendations, and 2 observations or 3 observations for things to consider as you formulate recommendations. The first thing of difference between the America strategy and the Indo-Pacific is the time frame. You've heard Ambassador McKay and ADMEP describe the strategy as a generational challenge, a generational response to a generational challenge. This is language we didn't hear with the America strategy, and we don't traditionally hear in Canadian foreign policy. I tell you, from talking with foreign officials, talking with think tanks in the region, this statement really got people's attention. So the time frame difference was a huge signal. The second were the resources that were set aside. Putting aside serious money was very important. The third thing that the strategy did was talk about the inevitability of China. And I'll spend a couple seconds on this. The America strategy was in some ways seen as optional for Canada, but China is not optional. India is not optional. And what I mean is, it's not because they're our second largest trade partner. That is not the point of China's inevitability. You've heard other witnesses say China is the world's second largest economy. It's the leading trade partner with 120 countries, not just in the Indo-Pacific. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, Peru, Panama. In our own hemisphere, if you're trading, you're going to run into China. China spent $1 trillion building the infrastructure that receives and moves our goods when we ship them abroad. We struggle to build trade infrastructure. Ever since the Asia-Pacific gateways, which were the highlight for Canada and the highest point of our trade infrastructure rankings, we've struggled. China is responsible for the infrastructure on the other side that moves our goods. So even if you try to run away from China, you're going to run away. You're going to run into China, and you're probably going to be doing so on roads built by China. The last point is capacity. Under the America strategy, there was not much money for new capacity for Canadians, not just business, but the full range of Canadian stakeholders to be able to engage in the region. With the Indo-Pacific strategy, we have those investments, not just trade commissioners, not just an academic center, but money to bring the full range of Canadian actors up to speed. Again, if you're going to run into China, even if you try to run away, you need to have the full range of Canadian actors that will run into China better prepared. We tend to bring up expertise from the U.S. to do this, and the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think, corrects that. We need our own expertise, our own analysis, our own experts analyzing on Canadian perspectives. The last point, with the North American trade negotiations, we had the Americans scaring us away from engaging China at the very same moment that the Americans were negotiating their own trade agreement with China, one that positioned them to take market share and money away from Western Canadian producers. So with the Americans, we cooperate on security and intelligence, but if there's money on the table, we need to have the ability to defend our own interests with them, and that is certainly the case on China. We've seen it in the past, and with India, we may be seeing the same thing. So I'll leave it there and welcome your questions, and I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dade. Now we'll go to our questions, and we'll begin with Mr. Kimmich for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to just begin by noting that Minister Freeland is not appearing today like she said she would many, many weeks ago. It's been many months since she had been asked by this committee to appear on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So I just want to put on the public record the profound disappointment on the Conservative side that she has chosen to not be here again when she would have known and much ahead of time that she was going to be expected to be somewhere else, and that she did not provide a new date on which she would appear to testify before the committee on exactly what's going on with Canada's participation in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So, Mr. Dade, I'm going to have to ask you to excoriate the government on LNG, because you wrote back in December 2022 an opinion piece with the CEO of the foundation, Gary Marr. From a Western Canadian perspective, there are two major misses in the strategy. There is no mention of exporting LNG. And you go on, instead, the priority strategy pivots to renewables and hydrogen. Others have excoriated the government. I have to give you a chance as a Westerner to excoriate the government here as well.
I was really hoping to use the time for other things. No, I think it's, we have a strong stance. I think everyone knows the logic of that, and the problems with that have been described by others. Dr. Lilly is an honorary Westerner, so I could contribute this to her to some degree. But yes, time and time again, we hear from allies in the region the following question. Canada claims it wants to help. Canada claims it wants to be involved in the region. Canada claims to want to be able to contribute. Why then are you hoarding the one thing that we need most? Why are you hoarding energy? And trying to explain to folks, well, no, we're not hoarding it. They're just these political difficulties. And then folks say, well, you know, we're getting your gas from Mexico. Costa Azul has come online in Baja de California and Mexico. So if Mexico can send us your gas, why can't you? And it's a really, really difficult position to try and defend that. We worry about it from the security perspective. We worry about it from the competitive perspective, and we once again see the Americans eating our lunch, taking it off the table from us and eating it. If we don't produce it, someone else is. We're going to make greenhouse gas emissions worse by having places like Senegal, who's just discovered 11 trillion cubic feet of gas, exporting gas than if it's coming from Canada. We're doing no one any favors with this. We're probably harming the environment. So how's that for excoriating, even though I didn't want to?
I'd give you more time to do it as a Westerner. You can keep doing it. But you also wrote in 2023, in January, in the Globe and Mail, a critique of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, specifically for not making the proactive expansion of the CPTPP a priority focus area. But in 2024, Canada is taking over as Commission Chair for the CPTPP. So I'd like to hear from you as a Westerner. At the end of this year, what does failure look like, and what does success look like? What are the metrics? What do you think the government has to do right, and what will failure look like by end of year if it doesn't do that?
Sure. Let me start by saying we're huge fans of the Indo-Pacific strategy. We think that it corrects a lot of things that were missing or builds upon some of the successes in the America strategy. So we have very specific complaints. But on the TPP, look, what we need with the TPP is a degree of modesty. Leadership, trying to exercise leadership at the TPP would be failure. The region does not want Canada's leadership. The region does not need Canada's leadership. The region wants Canada to put its shoulder to the wheel and do the hard work of improving the agreement. There's a review of the agreement. What needs to be strengthened in the agreement? What needs to be changed? We have to start showing up and doing the unglamorous, hard work of building the agreement and doing the nuts and bolts. We're still digging ourselves out of the hole that the Prime Minister dug in Da Nang when he embarrassed the Japanese Premier Abe and had the Australians cursing us out in public. We're rebuilding from that. You don't do that with bold claims of leadership. You do it by showing up and doing the hard, unglamorous work. That's what success looks like. Failure looks like trying to claim leadership at a summit where people neither want it nor need it from us.
So you said about the hard work that is to be done this year as the chair of basically the CPTPP. So what are some of those parts that the government should be focusing on? Like what should those announcements be this year of work actually done?
You're going to get on the Indo-Pacific strategy separate from the TPP. I expect the government to release a update on the strategy and implementation steps. If that doesn't come out, then I'd be worried. But it's time for the government to be able to show what it's done and to put out a report card, in essence. So I'd look for that. On the TPP itself, I would look for steps that would allow Australia to continue with looking at ascension. How are we going to set the criteria for other countries to join? That will not be done at this meeting, but we can begin the work and make sure the Australians are well positioned to continue it. Not glamorous. It's not going to get headlines in CBC or the Globe, but that's the type of hard work. There's a review of the TPP. What concrete changes do we need to make to the agreement in terms of the rules as they've been working or not working? So those little things are what I would expect or hope would come out of Canada's chair.
You are out of time.
Thanks,
Mr.
Chair.
Mitch. We will now go to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just as Mr. Kimmich put on the record, I want to make sure that the viewers at home, of which there may be many thousand, are very aware that the Deputy Prime Minister was unable to attend tonight's meeting because she has had travels to Ukraine and Poland. I can't confirm Latvia, but I understand that is also perhaps on the agenda. And this is the second anniversary of the illegal invasion of Russia into the sovereign territory of Ukraine. And the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense are standing in solidarity completely with the people of Ukraine, recognizing that the war that they are fighting is also on our behalf. And that I am very proud of our Deputy Prime Minister, who is fluent in her Ukrainian language skills and has a huge value added to ensure that Ukrainians understand that Canada will continue to stand with them. We are disappointed as well that she wasn't able to be here. However, she has very clearly said that she understands her role as being accountable to Parliament, and she will attend a future meeting when we can schedule it. And I just wanted to make sure that that was understood, because I think Canadians do wonder both about the Conservative support for Ukraine, as they have failed to support them in a free trade agreement, which was the request of the government of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine. And now we are hearing that a brief appearance at this committee is more important than standing with the people of Ukraine, which our government will always do. Just glad to put that on the record, too, for those watching at home. One brief question for Mr. Dade. You said that witnesses excoriated the government of Canada with respect to LNG. Are you aware of the testimony given by the ambassador of Japan to our committee last week, where he spoke very positively about the future of LNG exports, which would be available for the Asia-Pacific region, particularly Japan, and his looking forward to the opening up of that capacity for Canada to provide energy for Japan?
Yes, I am. I've read all the committee testimony.
Thank you.
Before coming in.
I want to go to Mr. Cowett now. Mr. Cowett, thank you very much for your, Professor Cowett, for your testimony. I was reminded during the testimony of my first-year course in economic history with Professor John Monroe. And he looked at the ebbs and tides of economic power and primacy of various countries over centuries. And I think your analysis around the power shifts towards China and both the huge challenges that Canada faces with respect to that those changing dynamics of where money is, where money lies, but you also acknowledge that there's a reality of China's position. And I just wanted to give you a little chance to talk about a little further on the emerging China and both the dangers that presents for Canada, including challenges, but also the opportunities that could present in the future for Canada, and how we can best prepare ourselves for a world that is in flux over the next 50, 100, or 150 years.
Yeah, that's a broad question, but it's a relevant question. I think we're at the moment where in policy science, sometimes we talk about the tectonic plates moving. I think we're at a moment such as this. I think the Indo-Pacific strategy was a step forward in terms of defining more clearly what Canada can do. It also was much awaited for years in the region. So Canada had been involved, but in a very different time. But sometimes in the past, it was very present in the 80s. There were times that it would draw. And then the Indo-Pacific strategy tried to make a stand that it will engage on continuous time, over time, the Indo-Pacific region. Je vais continuer en français.
I'll continue in French if I may. I also feel that Canada needs to understand its role in this power shift and realize that Canada was previously seen as a middle power, and I think that this role is being acknowledged less and less. In the region, there are countries that are in emergence, Southeast Asian countries that are in China's backyard, that have had to learn how to negotiate with this emerging power. And I think that we should emulate Singapore, Malaysia's and Indonesia's model. They're in constant dialogue with China. And I think that there are standards, as that my colleague, Mr. Vaillancourt, raised, the human rights abuses in forced labour camps, and that there were sanctions that were imposed. But dialogue remained in place nevertheless. And I think that the most important thing in the Indo-Pacific strategy is sustainable development, for example. Currently, China is the main producer of electric vehicles in the world and also of solar panels. So there are areas of common interest and cooperation that should be investigated in. Secondly, it's important to work alongside with allies rather than directly confronting China. And this kind of dialogue can take place in a forum like ASEAN, which works on a consensus model. In the past, we've approached these organizations in Southeast Asia like NAFTA or like European free trade agreements. But it's important to favour this dialogue and avoid remonstrating or castigating those representatives from the region, causing them to lose face.
To interrupt, Mr. Oliphant's time has expired. We'll now perhaps Mr. Bergeron would pick up where Mr. Oliphant left off and have further discussion with you, or
Pas nécessairement, mais je vais quand même mettre.
Not necessarily, but I will ask Mr. Coet other questions. I'm going to ask a question that perhaps has to do with that question. In an article that you co-drafted for a special edition of the Canadian Foreign Policy Review entitled Canada and Southeast Asia in the New Indo-Pacific Era, you alluded to 4 challenges that Canada has to rise to strengthen relations with Southeast Asia. And the 4th challenge that I'd like to focus in on, ASEAN, is that Southeast Asian countries don't want to take a stand in terms of rivalries between superpowers. In other words, they don't believe that there should be a complete alignment with either China or the United States. That's not a desirable strategy on their part. Some countries are a tad closer to China, others a little less. But you raised the issue of Canada's reputation and tied to the fact that Canada, a bit like the United States, has identified China as a global power that is increasingly playing a disturbing role on the world stage. Your thoughts, please. Response. Well, that's a good question. I think that colleagues at Foreign Affairs thought a long time before they came up with the word disturbing, quote unquote. They were probably looking for an adequate descriptor, but I think that the idea of turbulence is more appropriate. We're traversing a period of turbulence and a power shift, which is underscored by this turbulence. And we don't know what's going to happen in November, for example. For a long time, Canada has banked on its reputation as a friendly country with which other countries can dialogue. That dates back to Pierre Trudeau's reign. Canada was perceived as a capable power that had its own foreign policy, its own ideas, and at the same time able to unify various powers around the same table. But one thing has changed, and that is this. Our colleagues in Asia have said that if it's a conservative government that's in power, well, that'll be different to under the Liberals. But the fact remains that Canada has a reputation to maintain, regardless of which power, which country, which party is in power. So the number one challenge is to work hand in hand with partners in Southeast Asia, our Japanese partners, for example, who have been very present in the region, and also by playing a dialogue facilitation role. We tried to do this in 1992 and 2002. Canada was supporting regional dialogue. And one of the important things to stress here is that the neighbouring area to China, well, there was no conflict between countries in the same region per se. So ASEAN works on a distinct model, and the alliance has proven its worth. And I think that the doctrine of human security that was put in place by Mr. Oxworthy in the past, and the humanitarian interventions in the past of the Blue Berets, we've found a role in Canada, which as a soft power. And I think that we should resume this role as a soft power. I think the Indo-Pacific strategy is a first step, but the big challenge is implementing it properly. And in the past year since it was implemented, I think that a number of steps and efforts have been made, but sometimes we've put our foot in it. And instead of restoring our reputation as a soft power that is able to unify different players around the table and promote spaces for dialogue, we have shot ourselves in the foot. For example, the anti-mine treaty or the Uyghur issue and the whole issue of human trafficking. I think Canada has expertise there, and we should be banking on what our strengths are rather than going off in too many directions as we seem to be doing with the Indo-Pacific strategy. I'd like to come back to the term disturbing that was used. You kind of conflated the word disturbing and turbulence in your response, and I think that something that's disturbing creates turbulence. And I think that a number of Southeast African countries have been grappling with this definition. I remind you of the third challenge, and that is the strategy is facing on security issues and a greater military presence in the Indo-Pacific, a greater presence of Canada in the Indo-Pacific. Whereas this perhaps isn't in line with the priorities of Southeastern countries. So once again, is this having an adverse effect on our reputation that you alluded to in your second challenge?
If you could, thank you.
Merci. Je pense que vous touchez un point.
Well, I think that you've hit on an important issue here. Instead of focusing on our expertise, for example, supporting civil society organizations, consumers who are looking for safer products, for example, negotiating free trade agreements for fairer trade, by focusing on the military aspect, which is certainly not Canada's trademark, the military aspect. We're trying to do everything at the same time, and in doing so, we're not doing any of our jobs well. We forget what sets ourselves apart from other countries. It's Canada's value added, and I think we need to be modest in the role that we play on the world stage.
Mr. Bergeron, we'll now go to Mr. Boulris for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Et puis...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. And just like some colleagues around this table, I'd just like to make a preliminary comment, if I may. One of the biggest exports has been thermic carbon, and in 2021 the Liberal Party promised to put an end to Canada's exports of this thermal coal. It was even in the Minister of the Environment's mandate letter, and what we're seeing is the year after, there was an increase in exports of thermal coal to the tune of 8 times, and this is very worrying, and it flies in the face of all our commitments when it comes to combating climate change. I wanted to flag this because I find this contradictory, and I'm very proud of my colleague's private member's bill, which seeks to put an end to Canada's exports of thermal coal. Unfortunately, the Liberal government continues to export this product. Mr. Vaillancourt, I really liked your remarks earlier regarding human rights and workers' rights and forced labour. And you spoke at length, and rightly so, about the dramatic situation that the Uyghur people find themselves in. You also talked about Canadian companies' responsibilities, and perhaps if I have time I'll come back to that, but also the federal government's responsibility to ensure that our supply chains, for example, contractors that are hired, are not involved in forced labour. And Mr. Beladvos from La Presse, a journalist, in 2021 stated that millions of dollars of contracts were given to a Malaysian company that at the time was suspected by the United States and the UK of using forced labour in its production. Now, in your opinion, how can the federal government take steps in that particular region to avoid that kind of thing happening, or is the federal government actually not playing a leadership role whatsoever? Response. Well, that's a very important issue you've raised. And in my opening remarks, I proposed 3 important measures that I'd perhaps like to come back to now. The first of which is adopting legislation to prevent forced labour. And our US neighbours have interesting legislation in that regard. They have prohibited a lot of merchandise and goods from entering the United States that has involved forced labour, much more than the Canadian government has. Given that a lot of the Uyghur people have been involved in forced labour, and we have a role model, our neighbours to the south, who we should emulate. A second thing, binding legislation on due diligence from companies and corporations. A number of stakeholders and organisations have called for this binding legislation, and I think that should be done. The third thing that I'd call for is an overhaul of the Canadian Ombudsperson that would become an independent organisation with powerful investigatory powers. Unfortunately, the Ombudsperson is only relying on data that companies actually submit, whereas there should be a requirement that these companies hand over data that would be much more meaningful and not cherry-picked, and that would allow for proper investigations and a better assessment of the products that come from China, produced oftentimes as a result of forced labour and in dubious conditions, shocking conditions, I might add. Thank you very much. Well, there should be corporate responsibility, and these companies should be providing data on their conduct, and I think that it's absolutely absurd the way things are carried out currently. There needs to be some level of independence. The TPP changed names, and in a previous article with Ms. Sujata Day, you said the use of the word progressive was quite ironic. You were polite. I don't think that if you put lipstick on a pig, it changes the fact that it's a pig. And you said, despite gender equality and Indigenous rights undertakings on the part of the Trudeau government, the TPP has no specific clauses in that regard. Only the preamble does, and it's only symbolic, and it has no binding powers. So Canada is the president of the CPTP Commission in 2024. How can Canada further promote its own undertakings when it comes to gender equality and human rights? Response. Well, I think that gender equality should be in the accord itself, in black and white. And this, oftentimes, this kind of thing can be found in extraneous chapters, and in no way are the provisions binding. So I think were this free trade agreement to be revised and overhauled, it should state clearly in the body of the free trade agreement all the progressive aspects that you've alluded to, because it's ironic that currently it's called progressive. There should be concretely progressive elements to these accords. Now, in the Ukraine-Canada Free Trade Agreement, a number of environmental concerns have been factored in. It proves that we can achieve this, that Canada can do it. But I think that we need to go much further when it comes to region negotiating and opening up free trade agreements. I think that all of the free trade agreements that Canada has negotiated over the major years of free trade were liberalisation agreements. And I think that environmental concerns and human rights concerns were secondary at the time. And I think that the focus was put on the corporations themselves and their and trade. But I think the time is ripe now to overhaul these free trade agreements and include those kinds of concerns.
Time has expired. We'll now go to Mr. Chong for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The second highest merchandise valued export to the People's Republic of China in 2023 was bituminous coal. And, you know, when we look at the record of China on climate change and coal, their words and Western governments' approaches to this issue are completely contradictory. 10 years ago, I think it was reasonable for Western governments to propose cooperation with China on climate change and GHG emissions. Many people, including Western governments, thought coal demand would peak in 2013, including the IEA, I might add, and decline from there. They thought the PRC would work in good faith with the world community on reducing emissions, but A report came out last year from a Finnish-based non-governmental organization and called the Center on Research on Energy and Clean Air and Global Energy Monitor, which is a second not-for-profit that monitors fossil fuel infrastructure. In 2022, China approved the largest expansion of coal-fired power plants since 2015. And in the rush to build these new coal-fired plants, they granted permits for 106 gigawatts of capacity in 82 new locations across China, the highest number since 2015 and 4 times higher than in 2021. As a result, China is now burning more coal than the rest of the world combined, and the world this year is burning more coal than it ever has, a record number. Last year it burned a record amount of coal, the world did, and so it did in the previous year. And so this is all because of China's absolute commitment to massively expanding the burning of coal, which happens to be one of our largest exports to the People's Republic of China. And so my question is, in November of 2021, Canada announced its intention to ban thermal coal exports in 6 short years to the People's Republic of China. Are these goals compatible? Are these two things compatible? That's my question.
So I'm not familiar with the figures you presented. I do handle the trade side. Fortunately, we have a natural resource center that focuses on energy, the environment, and the transition, the climate, the energy transition. But I'd be curious to see the numbers for India, too. I imagine that their numbers are going up. I know exports from Australia certainly have with their agreement. So I would say China is, you could say, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Someone from the other side who's on the clean energy side, the solar side, could say 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So there are many factors at play with China. I'm not trying to equivocate here. It's just a very complex, multifaceted engagement with them on energy and the transition. So there are things that China is doing that I think countries that are concerned about climate change and reducing emissions would be very supportive of, and there are things where they would be castigated. But I think that's across the board in the developing world.
Let me ask you this then. Nowhere in the government of Canada is there a definition of clean energy.
Yeah, I know.
Nowhere.
You've
And we pointed that out in committee a number of meetings ago. A large part of the Indo-Pacific document is based on the export of clean energy, but nobody can define what that is. Would you classify LNG as clean energy exports?
Let me just say, I did enjoy that particular session of that meeting. Yes, I would. Absolutely. These are critical. And I think the government recognizes this as well, that LNG is necessary. I keep getting mixed signals. We talk about the Japanese ambassador's comments. Japan is looking to transition. So I think if you're talking about engaging Japan on LNG, you have to recognize that it's a part of the transition. So I think there's some confusion perhaps on the government about this, but I do see a definition from them that includes LNG from time to time.
Do you think it's a reasonable foreign policy goal for the government of Canada to say that in order to contribute to the global fight against climate change, that we should make the export of LNG a priority in order to displace coal-fired electricity generation plants, seeing that they have double the greenhouse gas emissions per kilowatt hour of an LNG, of natural gas plants?
I think that in the limited contributions of significance that Canada can make, the move to LNG would be probably the second most significant contribution. The first being the largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions from Canada is the Government of Canada, followed by the provincial governments. You look at the release of GHGs from forest fires. You own the land, you own the emissions. So forestry policy would be one area that I haven't heard the government speak about in terms of forestry management practice. Cutting, the modern forestry practices would be a huge contribution. LNG exports would be second. Our LNG is going to Asia, but it's going through Mexico. So how about having us sell it, having us reap the rewards, having us sell lower impact LNG? It just seems to make sense. It's a policy in search of a problem is what I think of it.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Mr. Fragistatos for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. To Professor Coet, if I could begin with you, sir, could you? I just want to make sure I understand your point about soft power. I think it's important in the context of this discussion, but I just want to make certain that I've understood you. Was it then?
Sorry. Yeah. The concept of soft power was developed by Joseph Nye, an American political scientist. But the idea of soft power is that a country could exercise influence without being military. And that soft power is the power of persuasion, the power of attraction, and power of reputation. And that soft power is a key asset, and it has been a key asset in the past, as I mentioned, for Canada. I think this soft power that Canada had, its power of attraction has diminished over the years. And I think partly it's because there's been a lack of continuity in policies. I think there was much easier a while ago for Canada to engage on issues, difficult issues, for example, whether it's environmental issues, forced labor. There was a receptivity. I think the idea now is that it has been Canadian policy towards Southeast Asia and Asia, or in the Pacific, was a bit not confused, but not specifically directed. What I'm trying to argue is that we have more chances to influence whether it's environmental, whether it's labor condition, if we are at the table and being there as equal with partners in the region. So at the moment, I would say people are really focusing on China, and there's a China obsession in many ways. But as I was trying to point out, there are important Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, in the region, and these diaspora are the big businesses, and they are a very good, potentially a good ally for influencing policies on China. So I think Canada needs to be more modest in its claim and be at the table like equal with members of the Indo-Pacific region. And what the difference is also is that in many ways, and we see it in the other part of the world, like Canada is not needed or sought after. They can go to other countries. It's the time has changed. It's part of the change I was talking at the beginning of my intervention, that we need to understand in which position we are and what is the value added of Canada and where is Canada going to be respected and listened to and help. I think, as I was saying, one of the key point would be to help build consensus. And that Canadian soft power, has to be retaught. And I think unless it is clearly stated and it's a strategy that is not time-bound by election, that will be key in terms of restoring this capacity to facilitate processes that are more in line with our objective of environment, better labor condition, labor processes of migration that are where people can migrate under good condition. Indigenous people's right, which is a challenge that we face it also in Canada. So if we work as partners or counterpart in these processes, I think Canada's soft power capacity influence will be much greater, and not based on hard power, but because sincerely, I don't think it's hard power, which is military, that will be our trademark for the next, at least the next coming years or the next decades.
Oh, and I think you read my mind, sir, because I was trying to get your thoughts on soft power and then apply that to your initial comments in your opening on diasporas. But you've beat me to it, so I appreciate that, and I take your point that there's a lot of potential there in terms of not just the Indo-Pacific strategy, but writ large when it comes to security, when it comes to economic policy, that we look to diasporas. I think there's a lot of value added there. Mr. Dade, I only have 45 seconds left. If I could turn my attention to you. Very simple question. How critical is China to the economy of Western Canada?
It is our second largest trade partner when you look at what we export. So, for example, agricultural goods. 13% of Canada's trade on agricultural goods is with China. That's higher than the total for overall trade with China. So it's absolutely critical that we engage and do so intelligently.
I asked well, you say to do so intelligently. I couldn't agree more. Sometimes I hear musings, and not maybe in that kind of language, but something approximating a call for an embargo does come up from time to time. whether it's in the House in debate or in other places from Conservative friends. But I think it's important to understand that issue before engaging in the kind of hyperbole that we sometimes hear.
So if I could mention, when Donald Trump launched his trade war with China, U.S. farmers were compensated to the tune of, I think, 20 billion U.S., which would be the entire GDP of Newfoundland and Labrador, or 10 times the budget of the Canadian ag and ag foods. So if you are going to do those things, you have to be aware of the cost. And as with the Americans, you have to be prepared to defend your values, to pay the price of your values. Your values carry a cost. Before speaking publicly about going to defend them, you have to be prepared to pay the cost, or you undermine your values. If you're not willing to defend them after saying you will, you undercut their value. So that $20 billion, I think, it doesn't mean you don't do it. It just means you have to know the cost and be prepared for it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fragosatos. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron. 2.5 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to come back to you, Mr. Coët. In an article that you co-drafted with a colleague in La Presse and published in November 2023, you referred to Quebec's Indo-Pacific strategy published in 2021. In what way can it be complementary to Canada's? Well, that's important. We often forget this fact, but Quebec was the very first to issue an Indo-Pacific strategy a year before Canada did. And Quebec wasn't the only one to do so. There were about a dozen Indo-Pacific strategies. And I think that Quebec's Indo-Pacific strategy demonstrates that Quebec's intention to take its place in the democratic apparatus at UNESCO or the International Organization for the Francophonie. And I think that strategy was a step forward because it focused on diversifying partnerships and reducing reliance on China. And in doing so, this provides for greater leverage when negotiating with China. If China knows that it's the only country that can produce certain goods, well, it's going to take advantage of that. But if there are other partners that we engage with, and we often forget that the Southeast Asian region offers similar products that are part of the same value and chain. So the Indo-Pacific strategy demonstrates that the global economy has moved towards Asia, and secondly, it's important to develop expertise, and this will be my final point. I think that we need to bolster both Quebec and Canadian expertise, including Western Canada. When it comes to the region, I think that we need to be present in the region, and we need to further develop our expertise in that regard. We often forget that there are long intellectual traditions in the region, philosophers that we forget about, Asian philosophers that we don't read often. But they help us to get a better handle on the region that we're dealing with. And it helps to provide ties between NGOs and diasporas. And I think that Quebec's Indo-Pacific strategy is a step in the right direction. I salute it. We need more of them. And just like the Canadian strategy, it needs to be enduring. It can't just be concocted and then forgotten about. We need to focus on it going forward.
We'll now go to Mr. Bolaris for our final 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Mr. Vaillancourt, in 2016, before the International Trade Committee, you referred to the TPP by referring to your concerns about the dispute settlement mechanism between investors and states. At the time, this gave huge rights to private companies, in stark contrast to democratic rights. Now, a couple of years later, do you still see this as an issue, as a threat, as a challenge? How have things evolved over time? Well, we still see this as a threat. It gives far too much power to companies, these ISDSs. But one thing that must be mentioned is that this mechanism was excluded from the free trade agreement CUSMA. So we can enter into free trade agreements without having investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, evidently. And globally, there's a lot of criticism of these mechanisms, which, as I said, give companies far too much power with any obligation for reciprocity. It's one-sided, and it gives them disproportionate power, and it has a chilling effect. Under these mechanisms, countries can threaten governments with litigation, and they can actually lobby changes to regulations, and we've seen this occur on a number of occasions. These mechanisms are supposed to preserve democracy. We believe that these mechanisms should be excluded from all free trade agreements that Canada signs off on. And earlier I referred to an investment agreement between Canada and China. There was a lot of protests against that agreement because, first and foremost, China doesn't always respect law and order, but in a sense, it gives China too much of a foothold, given that this is a non-reciprocal free trade agreement. So for all of these reasons that I've just evoked, these investment state dispute settlement mechanisms are problematic. And I'll repeat the position of a number of advocacy groups in Quebec, including ADAC, that fights or is in favour of inclusive globalisation, that these mechanisms must be excluded from all free trade agreements that Canada signs.
I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here. I think, just judging at the body language down at the end of the table, that you wish it would go on a little longer, sir.
I'm thinking Madame Friedland was unable to join us. I'm more than happy to take the extra time to obviate her so that we can
No,
let her off the
I think
hook
we've
for
set the
this.
record for excoriating tonight, so that... Anyway, listen, I want to thank witnesses and our guests, Mr. Bolaris, Mr. Fast, and Mr. Zuberi. I also like to thank the clerk, analysts, translators, and staff, and with that, we'll call it a night.